We took two identical F-150s, put one on a 6-speed transmission and the other on a 10-speed, and drove them both to 150,000 miles to find out which one actually holds up. Not a spec sheet comparison, not a dyno pull, real miles, real towing, real winters. I've rebuilt more Ford transmissions than I can count, and I went into this test with a strong opinion about which one would win. By 150,000 miles, I was surprised at how close it actually was, and even more surprised by which failures showed up and when. Here's exactly what happened to both trucks, mile by mile. Let's start with what these two transmissions actually are, because most owners think 6-speed and 10-speed just means more gears and nothing else. The 6R80 is the 6-speed automatic that Ford put behind the F-150 starting in 2009, and it stuck around all the way to 2019 on some trims. It shares its roots with a ZF-designed 6-speed architecture that Ford heavily re-engineered for its own trucks. It is a mechanically simple unit by modern standards. 6 planetary gear sets, a fairly conventional torque converter, and a valve body that Ford refined for a full decade before it was phased out. By the time the 6R80 was winding down production, Ford had basically worked every bug out of it. The 10R80 is a completely different animal. Ford co-developed it with General Motors, which is why you will find a nearly identical transmission in certain Silverados and Sierras. It debuted in the F-150 for the 2017 model year, paired first with the 3.5-liter EcoBoost, and eventually spreading across most of the lineup. 10 forward gears means tighter ratio spacing, which lets the engine sit closer to its efficient RPM range, no matter what speed you are doing. More gears also means more clutch packs, more solenoids, and a dramatically more complex valve body. On paper, the 10-speed should be the better transmission in every measurable way. More gears, better fuel economy, quicker shifts, and a torque converter that locks up earlier to reduce slip. That is exactly why I wanted to test it against the transmission it replaced. There's also a philosophical difference in how these two units were engineered, and it matters more than most owners realize. The 6R80 was designed in an era when Ford prioritized durability margins over squeezing out every last tenth of a mile per gallon. The clutch packs are sized generously, the torque converter spends more time in a partially unlocked state to absorb shock rather than fighting it, and the whole unit was built with a wide tolerance for driver abuse. The 10R80 was designed under a completely different set of pressures. Corporate fuel economy standards were tightening every year the truck was in development, and Ford needed a transmission that could deliver measurably better efficiency numbers without redesigning the engine lineup. That meant tighter tolerances, more aggressive torque converter lockup schedules, and a control strategy that is constantly shifting gears to keep the engine in its sweet spot. Neither approach is wrong, but they create very different failure patterns down the road, and that is really what this test was designed to expose. It's also worth mentioning that both transmissions were paired with essentially the same engine for our test, which matters because a transmission's real-world stress load depends heavily on what it's bolted to. The 3.5-liter EcoBoost produces strong low-end torque from its twin turbos, and that torque hits the transmission early and hard under acceleration. A naturally aspirated V8 builds power more progressively, which is gentler on clutch packs during takeoff. By running both transmissions behind the same turbocharged engine, we made sure any differences we saw came from the transmissions themselves and not from a mismatch in how the power was being delivered. For this comparison, we sourced two F-150s as close in configuration as we could get. Both had the 3.5-liter EcoBoost, similar trim levels, and comparable mileage starting points. One came with the outgoing 6R80, the other with the 10R80. From there, we put both trucks through identical routines, same mix of highway commuting, city stop and go, and regular towing runs with a loaded trailer in the 6,000 to 7,000 pound range. Fluid changes were done on the same schedule for both, using Ford spec fluid, and every service was logged. We weren't trying to baby either transmission or abuse it beyond what a normal work truck owner would do. The goal was to simulate 150,000 miles of realistic ownership and see what broke, what needed attention, and what just kept running. We also tracked more than just repair receipts. Every 10,000 miles, both trucks went on a lift for a full visual inspection of the transmission, the cooler lines, and the pan gasket for any sign of seepage. We logged fluid temperature under towing conditions using a scan tool connected to each truck's transmission control module, so we had real data on how hot each unit was running, rather than just guessing based on how the truck felt. We also kept a driving log noting any unusual noise, hesitation, harsh shifting, or dash warning, no matter how minor, because those small early symptoms are often the first sign of a bigger problem down the road. Both trucks were driven by the same rotating group of drivers, so no single driving style skewed the results, and both were parked in the same conditions overnight, which matters more than people think since temperature swings affect fluid viscosity and cold start shift quality. This wasn't a lab test with climate-controlled dynamometers. It was as close to real ownership as we could get while still being disciplined enough to catch every relevant detail. The first 30,000 miles told two very different stories. The 10-speed truck felt noticeably smoother from day one. Shifts were nearly imperceptible under light throttle, and the extra gears meant the engine cruised at lower revolutions per minute on the highway, which showed up as roughly a 1 to 2 miles per gallon advantage over the 6-speed truck in identical driving conditions. Passing power felt stronger too, since the transmission could drop 2 or 3 gears at once to find the EcoBoost power band almost instantly. The 6-speed truck wasn't unpleasant to drive, but the gaps between gears were more noticeable, especially between second and third, where revolutions per minute would flare more under hard acceleration. If we'd stopped the test right here, the 10-speed would have won in a landslide. But 30,000 miles is nothing for a modern transmission. And this is exactly where a lot of reviews and comparisons stop, which is part of why so many owners get blindsided later. Between 30,000 and 60,000 miles is where the 10-speed truck started showing its first real weakness. Right around 42,000 miles, we noticed a shudder during light acceleration in the 40 to 50 miles per hour range, the kind of vibration that feels like driving over rumble strips for a second or two. This wasn't a fluke. It's a well-documented issue with the 10R80, and Ford has released multiple technical service bulletins addressing torque converter shudder on this transmission, along with updated fluid formulations and revised valve body calibrations to correct it. We took the truck in, had the fluid changed to the updated specification, and had the transmission control module reflashed with Ford's latest calibration. The shudder went away almost completely afterward, but it was a clear sign that the 10-speed's earlier torque converter lockup, the very thing that makes it more fuel efficient, was also creating friction and heat conditions the 6-speed simply doesn't experience in the same way. The 6-speed truck, meanwhile, had nothing to report in this same mileage window outside of a completely uneventful fluid service. No drivability complaints, no dash warnings, nothing. What's worth understanding here is why this shudder happens in the first place. The torque converter clutch is essentially a friction disc that locks the engine directly to the transmission input shaft to eliminate the slippage that normally happens through the fluid coupling. Locking up early and often is fantastic for fuel economy because it removes the inherent inefficiency of a traditional torque converter. But it also means that friction material is being asked to modulate partial engagement far more frequently than it would in a transmission that stays unlocked longer. Ford's engineering response was smart. Rather than redesigning hardware, they addressed it primarily through fluid chemistry and software calibration, adjusting exactly how and when that clutch applies pressure to smooth out the transition. It worked well enough that most trucks equipped with the 10R80 built after these updates rarely develop the issue at all, which tells you this was largely a calibration problem that got solved rather than a fundamental design flaw. Still, if you're buying a used F-150 with this transmission built before those updates rolled out, it's worth confirming with a dealer that the latest calibration has been applied. From 60,000 to 90,000 miles, both trucks were doing regular trailer duty, and this is where transmission behavior under load really separates good engineering from good marketing. The 10-speed truck handled towing impressively well once we consistently used tow haul mode. It downshifted intelligently, held gears appropriately on grades, and kept transmission fluid temperature in a reasonable range according to the readout on the scan tool. But we also noticed it was working harder to do that job. The sheer number of clutch pack engagements during a towing run, especially in hilly terrain, where the transmission was constantly hunting between gears 7, 8, and 9 to find the right ratio, meant more heat cycles on the friction material over time. The 6-speed truck towed the same loads with noticeably less gear hunting. Fewer ratios meant the transmission simply picked a gear and stayed in it longer, which is less efficient but also puts less wear-inducing stress on the internals during long tows. At the 84,000 mile mark, the 6-speed truck needed a solenoid pack replacement after we started getting an intermittent, harsh 2 to 3 shift. That repair ran about $450 and solved the problem completely. The 10-speed truck in that same range needed nothing beyond scheduled fluid service. We also compared cooler line temperatures during a specific towing route we repeated with both trucks, a 45-minute pull-up, a moderate grade with a loaded car trailer behind each. The 10-speed truck's transmission fluid peaked at a lower average temperature than the 6-speed trucks during this run, which makes sense given how many more ratio options it has to keep the engine and torque converter working in an efficient range. In pure thermal terms, the 10-speed was actually doing a better job managing heat during sustained towing. But temperature alone doesn't tell the whole story. The number of shift events and clutch engagements during that same 45-minute pull was more than double on the 10-speed truck compared to the 6-speed. Lower average temperature but far more mechanical cycling is a trade-off, not a clear win, and it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when people just look at a temperature gauge and assume cooler automatically means healthier. The 90,000 to 120,000 mile stretch is where things got genuinely interesting, and where I started reconsidering my assumptions. The 10-speed truck developed a second shudder complaint around 104,000 miles, this time under harder acceleration rather than light cruising. We pulled fluid samples from both trucks at this point and sent them out for analysis. The 6-speed's fluid, despite being on the same change interval, came back in noticeably better condition with lower levels of friction material breakdown and less discoloration. The 10-speed's fluid showed more wear byproducts, consistent with a transmission that's doing more shifting and holding tighter clutch tolerances to manage 10 gears instead of 6. We addressed the second shudder with another fluid change and a check of the torque converter clutch solenoid, which tested within specification but was clearly working overtime given the frequency of lockup and unlock cycles. This transmission demands to hit its efficiency targets. Around 112,000 miles, the 10-speed also threw a code related to a shift solenoid intermittently sticking. It did not strand the truck, but it did trigger limp mode once on the highway, which is unnerving no matter how minor the underlying cause turns out to be. The 6-speed truck crossed 120,000 miles with only routine maintenance. No codes, no limp mode events, no unexpected shop visits beyond that one solenoid pack back at 84,000 miles. Fluid analysis results are worth dwelling on a bit longer because they are the most objective data point we collected in the entire test. Friction material breakdown in transmission fluid happens as clutch packs wear and shed microscopic particles into the fluid over time. Higher levels of these particles generally correlate with more clutch engagement cycles and higher operating temperatures at the friction surfaces specifically, even if the bulk fluid temperature reads similar between two units. Since the 10-speed's control strategy relies on far more frequent partial clutch engagement to hit its efficiency targets, it makes complete sense that its fluid would show more wear byproducts, even on an identical change interval. This is not necessarily a red flag by itself. Modern clutch materials are designed to handle this kind of duty cycle, but it does reinforce why Ford recommends closer fluid monitoring on the 10R80 in severe duty applications like frequent towing, and why skipping fluid services on this transmission tends to catch up with owners faster than it does on the older 6-speed. By the final stretch from 120,000 to 150,000 miles, a clear pattern had emerged. The 6-speed transmission required less intervention overall, but when it did need work, the fixes were simple, well understood, and inexpensive because technicians have had over a decade to master this unit. The 10-speed transmission required more frequent attention, mostly centered around software calibration and fluid condition, rather than hard mechanical failure, but each of those visits took longer and occasionally required specialized diagnostic time that added to the cost. We tallied total transmission-related repair costs across the full 150,000 miles. The 6-speed truck came in at just under $600 total, almost entirely from that one solenoid pack. The 10-speed truck came in closer to $1,400, split between 2 fluid and calibration services tied to the shutter complaints and 1 sensor replacement related to the limp mode event. Neither transmission required a rebuild or catastrophic failure over the full test, which says a lot about how far Ford has come with both designs, but the maintenance burden and the type of problems each transmission produced were genuinely different animals. It is also worth breaking down not just the dollar amount, but the time each truck spent out of service. The 6-speed truck's one significant repair took a single afternoon at a shop, since the solenoid pack is a well-known, well-stocked part that any Ford technician can diagnose and replace quickly. The 10-speed truck's issues took longer to resolve each time, not because the parts were hard to find, but because diagnosing a shutter complaint properly means road testing, pulling live data, comparing it against Ford's latest technical service bulletins, and sometimes waiting for a specific calibration file to be released before the fix can even be applied. That's a different kind of inconvenience than a straightforward parts failure, and it is the kind of thing that does not show up on a repair invoice, but absolutely affects how you feel about owning the truck day to day. Fuel economy told its own story across the full 150,000 miles. The 10-speed truck averaged about 1.3 miles per gallon better than the 6-speed truck across identical routes and towing conditions, which sounds small until you calculate it over 150,000 miles of driving. At the fuel prices during our test period, that efficiency advantage saved roughly $1,100 in fuel costs over the life of the test. Factor that against the $800 gap in repair costs between the two transmissions, and the financial picture actually tilts back in the 10-speed's favor when you account for both fuel and maintenance together. That's the piece most people miss when they hear the 10-speed has more problems. It does have more problems, but it also does its job more efficiently every single mile, and that efficiency has real dollar value that offsets a good chunk of the extra maintenance cost. So which one actually wins after 150,000 miles? If the only thing you care about is raw mechanical simplicity, the fewest trips to the shop, and the lowest chance of ever seeing a shutter or a limp mode warning, the 6-speed is the clear winner. It's a transmission Ford had over a decade to perfect, and it shows in how uneventfully it just does its job. Every problem it had over 150,000 miles was minor, cheap, and easily diagnosed by any competent shop because parts availability and technician familiarity with the 6R80 are both excellent at this point in its life cycle. If you're the kind of owner who wants to buy a truck and forget about the transmission entirely for 150,000 miles, that's the unit that gets you closest to that outcome. But the 10-speed isn't the unreliable transmission its reputation online might suggest either. Every issue it developed during our test was addressed through fluid updates and software recalibration, which Ford has continued refining since the 10R80's introduction. Owners who stay on top of fluid changes and get the latest calibration updates when shutter symptoms appear tend to have a much better experience than the horror stories floating around enthusiast forums would suggest. And the fuel savings are real, not marketing fluff. Over the life of a truck, that efficiency advantage adds up to meaningful money back in your pocket. If I'm being completely honest about which truck I'd rather own for the next 150,000 miles starting today, I'd take the 6-speed. Not because the 10-speed is a bad transmission, but because simplicity and 13 years of factory refinement count for something when you're trying to avoid surprises. The 6R80 gave us fewer headaches, cheaper repairs, and a driving experience that, while less refined, never once left us guessing what was wrong. The 10-speed is the better piece of engineering on paper, and it will likely close this reliability gap even further as Ford continues issuing updated calibrations for newer model years. But based on what we saw across this specific 150,000-mile test, the older, simpler transmission earned the win through sheer consistency. If you're shopping for a used F-150 and see both options available, don't write off the 6-speed as outdated technology. In a lot of ways, it's the more finished product. If you found this comparison useful, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're planning to run this same kind of long-term test on the engines paired with these transmissions next. And you won't want to miss which EcoBoost variant holds up better under identical abuse. Drop a comment and let me know which transmission you're currently running and whether your real-world experience matches what we found here. Share this with anyone shopping for a used F-150 who's trying to decide between these two options. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.